Welcome to Ethical Edge Insights, conversations with ChangeMakers, a space for deeply reflective conversations with those shaping our world. Here we explore their journeys, their greatest challenges, their most significant contributions to date, the contributions they seek to make, and how ethics have shown up along the way. Join us as we uncover the stories that shape our shared future. Sue Langley, hello, fellow Aussie.
Hello.
Hailing from, where are you again exactly? Just south of Queensland. You're in God's country called?
I'm usually in Byron Bay, but I happen to be in Sydney right now.
Well, you know what? I'm just going to share something so funny because on the tip of my tongue was Bondi. And I'm not saying Bondi because that's not where she's from. She's from up north, and it wasn't wanting to come out. It was Bondi was sitting there. And how funny that you're actually in Sydney. So that I must have intuitively known something.
You must have.
I think that's hilarious. Anyway, you have a really interesting history. Yeah, professional history. You know, I've heard you talking about driving trucks, I think, and I would love for you to share, if you would, what you would like to across your history that leans into where you then fell or arrived into the positive psych space and the work you do now. And then we'll go on to the podcasting.
I think, yes. So I had various jobs, as many people did from the age of 11, paper rounds and those sorts of things. But my first sort of full-time job, I suppose, was as a long-distance truck driver. Well, I said lorry driver today, and the person I was talking to was, what's a lorry? And I'm like, okay, truck driver. I was a long-distance lorry driver in Europe for about 18 months. And interestingly, I am really grateful for that experience because being a female at the time, I was the only female lorry driver that I met in that 18-month period. But what it taught me was a lot about confidence, independence, relying on myself to get out of any issues because I had no choice. I had to figure it out. I really enjoyed being in a traditionally male-dominated area. I didn't experience issues as far as people treated me with respect. I didn't feel any sort of harassment or anything like that. I was probably spoiled a few times, on the freight boats. The chef would cook something specially for me, and I would share it with the rest of the people on there. But I didn't have any of that for the 18 months. I was very grateful. Then I went traveling. Then I joined the travel industry because I had been around Australia for a year, and so I wanted to tell everybody how amazing Australia was. So I spent about 7 years in the travel industry. And again, I think that shaped quite a bit in the fact that I got to travel to various places around the world. I was, I think, only 23 when I escorted a group of people from the UK out to Australia for 3 weeks. So again, looking after people and things like that. But also seeing different countries and cultures and expanding my mind. So I think that was pretty good. I dropped out of college. So along the way, I also did an A-level in psychology through distance education. And then I kept learning. I've always been really interested in learning. I just didn't like the formal process of, nobody in my family went to university. So, that kind of wasn't on the cards. But then I went to university later, and after time in the travel industry, I think what really piqued my attention is an A-level in psychology, but I'd started to read a lot of what was probably then pop psychology. And I found that I started teaching my team. So when I became into a leadership role, I started teaching my team some of the stuff that I'd been learning around things like self-efficacy, self-esteem, talking about increasing our self-awareness and things like that. And even though positive psychology wasn't a thing then, it was still, I could see, and I actually watched our profits double 2 years running in the company I worked with that I was leading. not because I was teaching them how to sell, excuse me, or customer service, because I was teaching them how to be the best version of them, which meant they did a great job of serving clients and selling. So I think that was my first sort of foray into psychology. And then as I say, I moved to Australia. I did my degree here in Australia via distance again, because didn't want to show up in class. And then I was lucky enough to meet Diane Vella-Broderick through my degree. And Diane Vella-Broderick, as you know, is the current president of the IPA, the International Positive Psychology Association. And so since then, Diane and I actually learned about positive psychology really together, because it was just starting then. And that sort of then found my way into creating the Diploma of Positive Psychology, doing my master's in Neuroscience of Leadership, and a whole range of other things that have come since. Long story, sorry.
No, no, I think it's great because, I didn't know the full story. I didn't know you started off with Diane. So where was it that you undertook your first studies? Because my entry into positive psych was through my psych degree at the University of Wollongong and through a lecture by Lindsay Oates on wellbeing. And so that I went, yeah, this is my space. And so I've been a part of it since then, really. Yeah.
Yeah, well, mine was many years ago when Diane was at Monash. So before there was no MAP programs. I think the
Right.
first MAP just started in my last year at UPenn. And as I say, it was all brand new. And there were
Yeah.
only 10 of us actually studying it with Diane as a sort of supervisor doing my BA.
Mhm.
And from there, I just sucked it up, and I wanted to go to do the masters at UPenn, but it wasn't feasible. I didn't have $100,000 to travel back and forth over a 6-month period for 10 trips. And so I downloaded the entire course list, book list, and and I read them all.
Wow.
And then I continued in the space. I'd already set up my own business, and I was talking about emotional intelligence. And for me, emotional intelligence and positive psychology, I just realized they're
Yeah.
hand in glove. They're the same side of things, or same but different.
Yeah.
Um, so I started to explore that, and then I did the Harvard course with Tal Ben-Shahar.
Mhm.
That was his very last year at Harvard that I did that via distance. Again, I always do things via distance. I'm not good at being in a classroom. And then I remember saying to Diane, oh, I still want to do the masters at UPenn. And I remember her saying to me, she said, oh, for goodness sake, you should be teaching it by now. So I thought, right, I'll do a master's in neuroscience of leadership as well, because I was fascinated in the brain. And then for me, it was those sort of three areas sort of coming together of how do they impact us. And I've been in the positive psychology space pretty much since 2002. And have loved every minute of just exploring how the science is developing, how we look at well-being now from a more, well, hopefully more of a systems-informed approach. Looking at it like I read lots now on economics and what we would do if we actually put well-being underpinning governments and policies and the economic models and things. And I also like to look at the genetics and the epigenetics and the microbiome, so I kind of bring that into it. And I love seeing things as a whole and saying, if we put the pos psych ethos under all of these things, what could the world look like? And that's what gets me excited.
Yeah. And you've gone on then to a really successful international career. In fact, I recall you mentioning once to me that you love talking.
Of course, that's what I do.
You love
It's the only thing I'm good
you
at.
like being there and delivering the information, but you're also facilitating when you're running all your groups as well. So it's not always you landing all the information on everyone. It's then encouraging people to how they might use it for themselves and others. So
Yeah,
yeah,
I have a saying actually, Wendy, and my saying is that what I really love is sharing knowledge and facilitating learning.
yeah.
So helping people get access to the knowledge so that they can then figure out how they're going to bring it to life. And I like to synthesize the science into really practical tools that people can use on a day-to-day basis. And I'm very lucky I get to do that most days.
And so one of the areas you're working in, which is really the reason for this call today, was that part of your delivery of information is engaging in lots of conversations on your podcast.
Mhm.
So tell us about where that began for you, the podcast idea, because you're celebrating something this week, I believe, with your podcast.
Well, it's interesting because I've actually done two podcasts today. So one at 6
Mhm.
a.m. and one at 6 p.m. So um, it really sort of started because, well, it actually started through our membership forum that we created a while back, 5 years ago, 2020, where I started Learn with Sue, which the idea of that was we had all of these wonderful people who graduated from the Diploma of Positive Psychology and Wellbeing. There were people out there around the world who'd done the masters, and people want to continue to learn. But the only real forums was sort of every other year going to the Positive Psychology in Europe, or every other year going to the World Congress. There wasn't really that sort of where do you go from here? So I created Learn with Sue, which was our member sort of, or is our member sort of forum, whereby people paid an annual fee, and we would do 2 sessions a month, one with an expert and one with me. And the one with the expert was great conversations with some amazing people. And the one with me would be, we would spend an hour talking about the research around awe, or the positive psychology ethics. We spent an hour discussing that and pulling it apart, etc. So then the podcast kind of came from that, because we had all these wonderful experts that were coming along for the full hour of the Learn with Sue session with the members. And it was like, well, we should share some of this. And so the sort of podcast sort of spun off that, really. But I have to say, Learn with Sue was purely a pet project. It has not earned me money. Certainly not as much as the time that I've put in, or my team. So it's definitely not a money earner. But I'm so grateful for all the people that signed up for Learn with Sue as a member sort of forum, because the opportunity to speak to some of the people, and to your point, I just sort of posted something about something coming up, and then I went through all the list of, well, not all of the people, but just some of the people that we've had on, and I'm like, wow, how
Wow.
lucky am I that I've been able to talk to all these amazing people,
Mm.
and spend an hour just, picking their brains on stuff. So I think that's really cool. I feel very lucky and very privileged.
For me, something that's really interesting about these conversations that I'm having through the ChangeMakers in Conversation and the podcasts is, I mean, I could have had you on either one, really, but I went for podcast for your podcasting, and it is about the conversations and what emerges in them. I've found in mine that people are always walking away from them going, I said stuff I wasn't expecting to say. There's kind of new stuff there for me. So I think that's really cool that these conversations can be really emergent as well, and incite some kind of bring some insights for them as well as everyone else is listening. What have you found
Well,
with your conversations?
yeah, it's a really interesting one, to be honest, Wendy-Ann. So quite a number of years ago now, I was invited to be a moderator of a half-day workshop here in Australia with Martin Seligman. So this was quite a number of years ago now. I was speaking at a conference, he was speaking at the same conference, and they wanted to do this half-day session. So we set it up, and he spoke for about an hour. Then I had on stage, me and him with the audience listening, of me asking him questions. And then we took the microphone and we went roving around the room with the people that had paid for this sort of half-day workshop. And it was really interesting because one of the things that transpired through that conversation is I recognized that I'd heard Martin Seligman interviewed numerous times on the radio, various things. And often he was interviewed by somebody who didn't really know about positive psychology, or had just been handed some notes on what to ask. Very professionally done, sometimes some very experienced, interviewers, but they didn't necessarily know pos psych. And in that afternoon, I was able to challenge him on stuff because I knew the theories, I knew the research. So I'd say, well, okay, but what you said there, how does this relate to so-and-so's theory here? And this, and this. And he was a bit like, oh. And so
Mm-hmm.
to your point, all sorts of things came out of that conversation that perhaps wouldn't have done had I not really been immersed for the
Mm-hmm.
last sort of, at the time, I think probably 15 years in the positive psychology space. And therefore it also opened up other conversations that were perhaps more personal. So it was just after Chris Peterson had passed away in 2020. 12, I think. So it was just after that. And so we had a really vulnerable, open conversation around that. And I remember at the end, Martin Seligman said to me, he said, "Oh, thank you for the dance." He said, "It felt like a tango, and I am so grateful, and I'd like to tango with you again, so to speak." And but it was this sort of back and forth. And I suppose to your point, on a podcast, if you do have somebody who's asking you great questions, sometimes things come up or the conversation goes off at a tangent. And I'm not saying I always ask great questions. Sometimes I'm sure I ask questions everybody else does, especially if somebody's got a book they want to talk about or whatever. But the thing that I love sometimes is when somebody goes, "Oh, good question."
Mm.
And then you're like, "Oh, where's it going to go now?" So that's where I think it gets interesting. And I think it's lovely for people to eavesdrop on those conversations, because that's what really a podcast is somebody
Mm.
eavesdropping on this conversation. And I think there's something kind of cool about that in a nice way.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And that very idea has also had me wonder about whether I just do these public live as well as recording them. But then I think there's something kind of consciously safe or unconsciously safe about it being just the conversation here. Yeah, we know it's being recorded, we know it's going to go public, but there's still some kind of safety. I think you don't have to worry about the audience right now in the way they're not present for us to see, but they're just back here. And so
Yeah.
it adds a level of intimacy and safety, I think, to the conversations. And maybe that is a good thing to keep.
Yeah,
Some of
I
my
often
thinking.
say it's eavesdropping. It's an opportunity to eavesdrop on a conversation, and I feel I've had some delightful conversations with people, and some of them I do with an audience. So the one at 6 p.m. today was with a live audience, if you like. Not that it, just the two of us on screen, so that was fine. And the one at 6 a.m. today was without live, like this. But I think when you feel that there's just the two of you, as I say, I think it's quite lovely that people get to eavesdrop on our conversation. And I hope they find something interesting. If they don't, then I've still had a great conversation.
Yeah, and I value great conversations, so it's always good fun, surprisingly, because I wasn't actually meant to be the person to be doing these, but I had to step in, and I went, actually, this is kind of fun. I think I'm just going to own it. Thanks.
Good on you.
So, with your work talking around the positive psych space and all the kinds of people who are very positive psych focused in research or practice, etc., it would be hard pressed, I imagine, to think of a conversation that was particularly challenging that you had to try and navigate. But I wonder if there was.
Yeah, look, I think for me, I because I've been in the space of emotions for a while. I think in the early years, maybe I wasn't as comfortable with emotions because not necessarily for my podcast, but just in general, because I sort of grew up with the British stiff upper lip that you don't talk about emotions and you pretend they're not happening, and those sorts of things. Can't possibly tell someone you love them. That would be awful. So very much around that sort of way of being. So I think some of my most challenging conversations were probably in those early years of talking about emotions, and somebody would bring up an emotion, I'd be like, "Oh my God, what do I do with that?" But I do think now, and obviously, I have been in this space a while, and my podcast only started sort of 5 years ago. That I wouldn't say there's been a challenging conversation. Because I don't find those emotions challenge. Like when I see one, I'm like, "Oh, there's an emotion, let's go down it." So I don't necessarily think that. I think the hardest ones probably for me, the most challenging for me is if the person isn't as talkative, and then you've got to get more nuanced questions and things like that. So that's where I think, because a lot of my guests, if you like, have been people either genetic specialists, epigenetic specialists, microbiome specialists, positive psychology gurus, emotion gurus, etc. Because I know enough, I can ask the more nuanced questions.
Yeah.
But I've just had some really lovely conversations from so many different elements of the scope of human flourishing. And I suppose, like many people, I started with the people that I knew,
Mm-hmm.
oh, here's my, friend, and here's my colleague, and here's my, partner's cousin, and here's this person. And and then I was kind of a bit nervous about reaching out to some of the sort of more famous people that I knew. And I have to say, I've been overwhelmed by the response. And my most overwhelming one, and he's in my head because he's come up twice today, and this is the third time. My most overwhelming response was from Todd Cashton. So I had never met Todd Cashton. And Todd, if you're listening, I had never met him. We've still never met in person. Actually, I have seen him in person, but I don't think he would have remembered me at the time. Maybe he would. But basically, I was connected to him on Facebook, but we didn't really know each other. And I sent him a message through Facebook Messenger, and said, look, I'd really love to have you on my podcast. I'm sure you're online with Sue, and I'm sure you probably won't, but you've got plenty of other things to do, and sure, you're so busy. And he just replied with, I'd do anything for you, Sue Langley, when? And I'm like, what? You don't even know who I am, surely. So I was impressed that A, he knew who I was, and B, he would come along. And we had a fabulous, well, I thought it was a fabulous conversation. He might have thought it was ordinary, but I thought it was a fabulous conversation. So I suppose, he's one of, most people that I've asked have said yes. Some haven't, but most people I've asked have said yes. And I don't know, I find that very humbling, very privileged that people would say yes. And therefore, I'm very grateful and very honored with the openness of the conversation that people have, the desire to share knowledge. So I wouldn't say I've had any challenging ones during my podcast. There were some perhaps challenging ones earlier, but they were probably, more my issue than the person's issue.
Yeah, tell me about this sense of overwhelm with Todd Cashton, and then I'll share my story, because he was actually the first person I spoke to, the first conversation I had. Like, and
Yeah,
that,
well, I just think, and our conversation went all over the place, and I loved
yeah.
it. And as I say, he's been in my mind twice today because I caught up with somebody who did a podcast with him earlier on today, Matt Iasiello, and Todd had a recent conversation with a chap called Ari, and they had a good banter around that. And he also came up through another conversation that I had earlier today about the awesome work that he does and things like that. So. But I think, Todd was the one that sort of stood out. But I've just been overwhelmed by how generous people are.
Mhm.
And I think that's lovely. They don't have to, but people are generous with their time. And therefore, most of the conversations I've had, have just been delightful. Marco Acaboni, I mean, goodness, his work around mirror neurons and cognitive emotional empathy was just like a great conversation. Barry Schwartz, oh my goodness, he's just the most delightful man ever. So there've been some, and people have come back 2 or 3 times, which is kind of nice as well. When I get demand from the audience, I'll like go back to them again and say, will you come back?
Mhm.
So I feel very lucky because I don't know how other people find it, but being in the space that I'm in, a lot of the people that are in my space do not live anywhere near me.
Mhm.
So I don't see them except once a year at a conference.
Yeah.
And so I suppose for me, again, this is why I say that the podcasts, or the Learn with Sue and the podcast that spun off from it, is probably partly my pet project, because otherwise I'd never get to talk to these people. And I love talking to them. I love feeling like I'm chatting to one of my peers in a particular space and having an in-depth conversation around hope that I just had with Andreas Kraft, or, mindfulness and mindlessness with Ellen Langer, or so, there's a joy in that for me.
Just as we don't forget Todd altogether, I just want to mention that Todd was my first conversation on the ChangeMakers in Conversation.
Ah,
I was extraordinarily nervous because I've heard him many times talk, and I'm like, how am I going to hold space with this guy? Because he just flies, and he can come out with an enormous amount of information in a short space of time. And I'm just like, holy crap, I don't know if I can do this. So anyway, I actually said it up front that I was actually nervous. I think it was even in the recording. It was a really, really, really good conversation, and he thoroughly enjoyed it. So Braun was finished with him with saying if anyone wants to listen to him, he actually now is on Substack and has lots of great conversations on Substack. It's called Substack, isn't it? I
Yeah.
think it's Substack. So anyway, you head on over to one of those communication apps. You'll find him doing lots of great talks. Um, what do you think? So I just want to bring this back to ethics again. You mentioned about spending time passing apart ethics in relation to positive psychology. What do you think would be one of the most prominent crutches that, or points of tension that people would find when they're working amongst positive psychology interventions?
Oh, I don't know if I have a good answer to that question, to be honest, Wendy-Ann. Um,
It's a horrible question, but you know.
so you're saying which would be the stickiest point when
Yeah,
people
yeah. Just not many of them. Just they're just something that just comes to mind in the first thought of that.
look, I think most people don't think about ethics or talk about ethics, etc. at all. And yet, one of the things that I do find is when you bring up an ethical scenario, most people get it.
Yep.
So it's not necessarily something that's often talked about, and it needs to be talked about more, which is fantastic for the work that you do. And I think there can be great conversations. Um, but one of the things that I do find is when you give people situations or scenarios where it comes up, people usually know the right thing to do. It's only if they then get pressured in a particular way that they cave, but they actually know the right thing to do. It's actually in my mind because not just this conversation, but a couple of last week I went to a networking thing where somebody was talking. I don't go to networking things very often because I'm not very good at them. And somebody was talking. They started talking about ethics, and they gave ethical scenarios. And one of them wasn't an ethical scenario at all. It was like a 1938 moral scenario about the train coming off the tracks and would you pull the lever? And I'm like, oh my God, that's not even, that's just so old. And so I got very annoyed. Um, but for me, ethics, when you feel, if I come back to emotions, for me, if I feel an emotion, emotions are data, they're information, they're trying to tell me something. When you look at what that data is, you will probably tell you you've gone off track. And I remember Robert Biswas-Diener saying once, if it's not always a red flag, but if it's an orange flag, he treats it as a red flag. And to me, that emotional response that you're getting that something's a little off is enough to go, no. And that could be a general ethical conversation that everybody would agree is an ethical conversation, but it can also be ethical for you. So for instance, I was, and again, this is just in my head because it's a conversation that I had this week, is in my early days of my career in my own business, I had the opportunity with one of our diploma students who'd come on the diploma. She then contacted me and said, I'm an L&D manager for this particular organization. We want to roll out a positive leadership program. We've got this many people. This is how over the next 3 years, this is what we want. I'd like you to deliver it. And I'm like, wow, awesome. I finally might actually earn some money in my own business. This is great. And I think it probably would have earned me over a 3-year period, I don't know, maybe $350,000 or something. And I said no, because it went against my values, which was they were a tobacco company, a cigarette company. Now, not everybody would agree with me there from an ethical perspective, because some people said, well, don't they have the right to good leadership? Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So we could argue that either way. It's a gray area. But for me, it was a red flag.
Yeah.
For somebody else, it might be a green flag. So it's not to say that mine is right. And I think, to your point, there are many ethical situations where people kind of know what's right or wrong. And then there are other things that might be linked to our values, which might be that's my ethical code or my values driven, but it might be different to somebody else's and doesn't mean it's right or wrong.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
don't think that answered your question, but it was kind of where my head went.
No, I like where you went. That's great. And it's true. It's like because it never is right or wrong. That's the point. And so
Right.
often society, whether it be professional or in your personal life, people are speaking about ethics as if there is a right or wrong. It's a switch, you're binary, and it is not, by far not. There's so many different layers to it. I actually quite like the train scenario. I think it's it is an old one, but often those oldies are really good just to have land people in the space of, this is the difference between what I would do and whether I would do it or not, and why would I do it. So it's self-awareness building in relation to their morals and the reasons why. And you can translate that to the professional space as well, and how they would work from an ethical perspective. So I think they're good, those little teasers like this on the spot. Would you save someone or save yourself, or would you save someone and leave the other five? And why would you leave the other five? Like, just, I think it's really great fun. But maybe I've got a bit of a sadistic personality, perhaps. I like to torture people on those tensions. I don't know. I think they're all growth enhancing scenarios to be delving into. So with your podcast, again, could you tell us the name of it? We haven't mentioned the name of it.
It's just called Sue Langley Walk and Talk, so that
Oh,
people can walk
okay.
and eavesdrop at the same time.
Okay, so it's where you started, but it's still the same. Cool.
Yeah, so it was Learn with Sue Walk and Talk, and now it's just Sue Langley Walk and Talk.
Talk.
Yeah.
Good. And if you could speak to someone alive or dead, and who you haven't spoken to yet, who would that be? A dream conversation.
Ed Diener, no question.
Oh.
And the reason being is because when I started Learn with Sue, Ellen Langer was my first guest. We were meant to go for an hour. 2 hours later, we were still talking and people were still on the call. And I had the idea that I really would have liked Ed Diener to be my last one of the year, which would have been in the December. And unfortunately, he passed away in the April. So was never able to join me. So Ed Diener would be somebody that I think would have been, well, I know, I mean, I was lucky enough to meet him a couple of times for brief conversations, but I know it would have been a wonderful, wonderful conversation. So, and I would have been able to hold on to that. So that would have been my choice.
You know, when you mentioned Ed Diener, it reminded me of my own story with Ed and the book Positive Psychology Coaching in the Workplace. I actually reached out to him because I would have loved for him to have written the foreword. And of course, he wasn't able to. And unbeknownst to me, that then it became the book dedicated in part to him and also to Tony Grant. That's it's quite emotive actually to speak about that. I wouldn't never have imagined that would have been an outcome from that book, that it would end up being dedicated to him.
That's very cool.
Yeah. So we're almost at the end of this conversation, and I've just jumped myself crazy because I've just thought about that story with Ed Diener in the book. I'm kind of a bit stuck right now. And I'd love for you to just share what you hope for your podcast as we close this chat out.
Oh my goodness, I don't think I've actually thought about it really. So it's a great question. Like I say, the whole Learn with Sue idea and the podcast that sort of spun off as really the pet project that allowed me to have conversations. So it's completely selfish, I suppose, initially, if I just wanted to talk to these amazing people. But I suppose what I hope for is that people enjoy it and people get something from it, something practical, and people get to hear from some of these people. And again, many of these people that have been on my podcast have been on dozens of others because they are generous with their time. So it's not necessarily about whether people are listening to my podcast or whether they're listening to somebody else's. It's more about sharing the wisdom of amazing people that are out there. For me personally, I just hope I get to have more great conversations with new and emerging researchers, older and established researchers, practitioners, people doing cool stuff. I've had mainly people in the pod psych space, but as I say, Caitlin Cowan, who, basically she studies the microbiome. She collects poo for a living and studies it. And she is brilliant. She's fascinating conversations, talking to people about, as I say, genetics, epigenetics. We had an epigeneticist on recently that was just so cool to sort of expand that learning. People like Peter Senge from the Compassionate Systems. So I suppose I just would like to continue in the hope that if I'm enjoying those conversations, then maybe other people like eavesdropping on those conversations.
Very good. Thank you, Sue, for your time here. We're finishing up. And
Yeah,
I've enjoyed our chat. We've gone off script. That's perfectly fine with me.
That's fine. I didn't know there was a script, so that's all good.
No, well, I did have some set questions I was going to ask, and in the end, I didn't ask them all, but they were answered throughout anyway. So it's been and we went in places I wasn't expecting, which is always a treat to have. So thank you so much for your time.
No, thank you, Wendy-Ann. It's been awesome. And thank you to everybody listening.